Some years ago, I heard a story, probably 5 or 7 years, about a class that took place at a university in the southern United States. The class was about warfare, the history of warfare, and the human element. But one of the students had a bit of a problem and stood up in class. He said that although they were looking at some of the causes of warfare throughout human history, he heard many people whose opinion it was that religion had caused many wars. But as he investigated, he found that those who held the opinion never substantiated it, and so he was looking for some help from the class and from his professor to substantiate religion as one of the main causes of warfare. The professor decided that that would be something that the class as a whole should look into. And so they came up collectively with a list of various conflicts throughout human history. And the job was, as each of them participated in it, that they would identify each of those conflicts, put with them some of the reasons for the conflict, have an ongoing tabulation of some of the deaths that occurred because of those conflicts, and then how they were resolved. And so they started working on that, and it took the length of time that the professor had for the course. It was sort of an extra that was put onto the course. What they found astounded them, because when they finished looking at the history of warfare going back thousands of years, they found that in fact there were very few incidences where religion was the focus of the war or the conflict that was involved. And so they continued to look at some of this data, and they found that the resolution of more of those wars were caused by the intervention of religious people, bringing together warring factions and ending up with peace. One of the other things they found was that although they had looked at various religions over a very long period of time, thousands of years, when they looked at atheists and atheism, they could attribute far more deaths to atheism and its practitioners. And they were astounded that although they looked back over thousands of years when it came to religions of various sorts, atheism had had only about 200 years of sway. And they were amazed that, in fact, religion had been a blessing to people and to peace, whereas atheism continued to be a problem for both. I'll let other religions speak for themselves, although I will mention one thing, that in Canada, our Muslim communities have called some of the extremism going on in the world not consistent with faith as they understand it, and they've even called jihadism a blasphemy. But they are speaking for themselves in our midst. I want to focus our attention more precisely on Christmas as we now journey towards it in this time of Advent. And I want to talk about one particular situation that was unique in warfare, and that was the Christmas truce of 1914. That was the first year of what we now call the First World War. At the time, they thought that would be the war to end all wars. No sane people would enter into that activity again, but that too is history. The Christmas truce of 1914 was never official. Try as they might, the warring parties could never agree on anything, and yet as Christmas approached, in the first year of the war, there was a ceasefire. Now, as with most ceasefires, even the official ones, it's tough to get everybody on board with it. And if you look for casualties in around Christmas, Christmas Eve, and Christmas Day of 1914, you'll find at least three casualties dead from sniper fire. But given the size and the scope of the battlefront during the First World War, it's amazing that this unofficial truce actually took place. Now, in some places, there was discipline enough to keep the combatants in their trenches, and even though there was very little or no fighting going on, they kept to themselves. They dealt with their kit, bringing it up to snuff. They dealt with their fortifications and their trenches, repairing certain elements of those as well. But in various areas along the front, people emerged from the trenches into no man's land, what had been a killing ground. And they not only went out to retrieve the bodies of the fallen, but some went to greet their erstwhile enemies, to share small gifts of chocolate, perhaps. And for at least a day and a night, there was no war. In certain areas, there were carol sings that would go on across various languages. It was known that certain games broke out as well, including soccer games. The Christmas truce of 1914 was never repeated because it made life difficult for the generals. The more mixing that took place, the less the soldiers wanted to go back to shooting at each other when the time came to do that, and whole units had to be replaced along the front line. Christmas made fighting more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. And I would suggest that anything that makes fighting more difficult, particularly between nations, should inspire hope in all of us. Secondly, I want to look at A Christmas Carol, and I know it's a work of fiction, but it seems to resonate with people at this time of year. Although Alistair Sim cannot be repeated or bettered in his portrayal of Ebenezer Scrooge, there are various different attempts to do just that. Pretty much in every generation, this work of Dickens resonates with people. It is essentially about greed and about how one man's greed drives his life and drives others into misery around him. And yet, on that one auspicious Christmas, the epitome of greed in Ebenezer Scrooge is met with Christmas spirit, past and present and yet to come. And that Christmas spirit is transformative in his life and in the lives of those whose lives he touches. Now again, Christmas is about giving and getting. And in our day, sometimes there's more of getting than there is of giving. Sometimes greed is fostered even in the midst of Christmas spirit. And yet there's something different about Christmas. And anything that makes greed more difficult should inspire hope for all of us. Christmas also makes discrimination more difficult. If we look specifically at the story that is contained for us in Luke's Gospel, we find that there are a number of people involved in this story. We hear about shepherds who are out doing their thing on the hills at night. And we need to remember that often those shepherds were treated in a discriminatory way. It was believed that since they dealt with animals and not people, that they were somewhat countercultural, social misfits, if you will. It didn't help that a lot of their work was done at night when respectable people would be asleep in their beds. And yet shepherds play an important role in this story. They're the first ones to be witnesses to a miracle that is transpiring not too far from where they are. And so it becomes difficult to discriminate against others, knowing this story and seeing the vocational patterns at work here. It's tough to look down our nose at those who have less than honorable vocations. We know that in that time, although we have to guard ourselves and recognize that there were gender roles in those days, and many thoroughly enjoyed those gender roles, we also have to recognize that when it came to legal matters or what have you, that you couldn't rely on the testimony of a woman in legal affairs. And so women were very much second-class citizens, leaving the roles aside for a moment. And yet in this story in Luke's Gospel, we will find that central to it is Mary. We will find also in companion stories that her cousin Elizabeth, who was barren and looked down upon herself, becomes central as well. Mary herself was an unwed mother, and perhaps that is why at some point she ran away from Nazareth to go and visit with her cousin Elizabeth for a significant period of time. It becomes very difficult, though, to look down your nose at the circumstance of other people or even at their gender when the story that we see as so beautiful holds up these women. We find that when the shepherds get to Jesus, they're surrounded by animals. That was nothing new to them. But this whole thing takes place in humble surroundings. And they meet up with a poor family, and the family doesn't even live there. So these are displaced people who later on will become refugees. It's very difficult to look down your nose at refugees or displaced people when the center focus of the story is exactly those type of people. And if we extend past Christmas into Epiphany and the coming of the kings or the magi to experience Jesus for themselves, we find that although their money would have been well received in Palestine of that day, they themselves would have been treated with suspicion, as all foreigners were. Samaritans, even half foreigners, were treated with disrespect. And there would have been some concern about an entourage coming from the east. But it's difficult to look down your nose at foreigners when they too are part of such a beautiful story. Again, it's not impossible to look down your nose vocationally at shepherds or gender-wise at unwed mothers or the poor and the humble or foreigners. Not impossible, but incredibly difficult. And anything that makes discrimination in the various veins of humanity more difficult should inspire hope for all of us. And so we enter a season of hope where humanity takes the place of fighting, of greed, and of discrimination, where something of God happens, but something far more human develops. And so we celebrate this time as being a difficult time for those things that we wish would go away at every time of year. So let's celebrate the humanity that we find as we progress toward Christmas. And let us celebrate the arrival of that poor, humble child in humble surroundings. Amen.